Okay, this is a teacher feedback on the recent Tempest essay. Caliban is to some respects a noble being, quote. To what extent do you agree with this view of Shakespeare's presentation of Caliban? The key words in this essay are to what extent, inviting you to look at both sides of an argument, and presents. You have to engage with how Shakespeare uses the devices of the stage to present the character. So it's very important to remember that you're being invited to show your knowledge of how Shakespeare presents characters on stage. So the obvious structure for this essay would be to consider, first of all, how he's seen as a savage, and go through all of the elements that present him as a savage, and then maybe the alternative side, to what extent can he be seen as noble, as a noble being. So you're offering different ways of seeing Caliban, and so you're getting marks for AA3. It's important to, at stages in the essay, show your own personal viewpoint, which is, again, an AA3 reading. What do you think Shakespeare's trying to do? So I would like to see in your essay phrases like Shakespeare seems to be saying, or Shakespeare seems to be questioning, or Shakespeare wants the audience to think about or question traditional viewpoints. So try to have some of this coming through. And various contexts need to be brought in to explain some of these viewpoints. I'll talk about context later. Okay, I want to talk briefly about how Shakespeare presents Caliban, and I'll run through some of these and some of the things that you should have perhaps mentioned in your essay. Firstly, the way he acts is obviously a way in which we judge him, but interestingly we get a view of Caliban from various characters before he comes on stage, particularly Prospero and Miranda, so we're being shaped as an audience to respond to him as a savage, but whether he comes across that way is perhaps being questioned. We learn something of his history. He's a native of the island, and his mum was a witch. Perhaps to the audience, anyone who comes from the bloodline of a witch would be seen as inherently evil or beastly in this day and age. So his heritage is suggesting his savagery in some way. However, maybe we're also being made to question that. Maybe we see that he has more of a right to the island than other people. So this idea of Shakespeare never presents black and white, but often grey. He makes us question universal truths, or question our own assumptions. And that's done very much through the verse and the prose. Caliban is a character who we expect to speak in prose, but often speaks in verse, so he kind of undermines our expectations. And maybe you might want to think about why Shakespeare does that. He speaks of the island in a very poetic way, and he's the only character to along with Gonzalo, to see the beauty of the natural surroundings. Maybe that makes him seem less savage and more noble. One of the ways in which Shakespeare forces us to make assumptions about characters is through direct comparisons with other characters. So one way that we see perhaps that, or we could see Caliban in as possibly quite savage, would be in the way that we're drawn to see comparisons with Ferdinand in the way they carry their logs. Ferdinand does it willingly. He's in the role of the courtly lover going through a trial to gain the woman he loves, whereas Caliban despises doing these acts. He does it only because he's scared of the consequences of his actions. He vows revenge on Prospero, just as other characters in the play vow revenge. Antonio and Sebastian, Stefano to an extent. He vows to take over the island, and again that feeds in with the various other characters who vow to take control and become leaders. And so maybe we we see in Caliban someone who has perhaps more justification or more right for doing these things than the other characters, and maybe we see him in a more positive light. So that's maybe a couple of ways in which Shakespeare uses comparisons or parallels in the play. Now, Caliban is an interesting character in that he should be just a subplot character who gives us some of the physical comedy and the slapstick, the misunderstanding, mistaken identity. But he's a character who straddles both the main plot and the subplot. And as a result, maybe he has more importance in the play than just being merely a comic character. And he has more noble aims to be free, to take charge. He vows revenge, just as Prospero vows revenge. And maybe Shakespeare's making us question who is the more noble of the two. One of the things that you're being assessed on is really also your ability to use the language of English literature, and you should always at times be aware of this for AO1 and AO2, that your answer should technically be using the language of literature. You don't need me to read these out to you, but these are some of the technical terms that perhaps you could be using within this essay, and it gives you an idea of thinking about your next essay. Okay, as we said, the essays are inviting you to ask to what extent do you agree. So it's inviting you to have different viewpoints about the question, about the presentation of Caliban, and being able to hold different viewpoints as well as having your own. So let's consider some of the ways in which we can read the character of Caliban. From a post-colonial reading or viewpoint, perhaps he becomes much more of a sympathetic character. Post-colonial means viewing texts from our time period after empire and after colonial expansion, and maybe viewing particularly how native characters are presented and what this tells us about the people presenting them. So broadly speaking, we might take a more sympathetic approach to Caliban as a sort of conquered native who's had his lands taken away from him. How he's viewed by his otherness, by his appearance, and he's defined by his difference. And yet Shakespeare might be questioning this in some ways, in the sense that he undermines our expectations of him, and we can go back to his use of language particularly, or we can go back to how Caliban acts in exactly the same way as other characters of perhaps more noble birth. We could perhaps in this post-colonial reading highlight some of the noble characteristics of Caliban through perhaps his language and his attitude to nature. Another way of reading the text is from a psychological viewpoint. It's kind of closely related to the post-colonial reading, but we could explore how Caliban's been affected by his slavery, and how an individual is the product of the environment in which they're brought up in. This might be a way of explaining his anger and desire for revenge comes from the fact that he's been shaped by Prospero, who is himself both angry and vowing for revenge as well. Perhaps we see his savagery as a result of the way he's been treated and the way he's judged as a monster, as something other, and so he acts accordingly. So this broadly comes into a kind of psychological reading of a character being a product of their time. From a theatrical point of view, we can see how Caliban serves many purposes. He serves the purpose of villain, outsider. He offers comic slapstick and subplot scenes. He's a character who allows Shakespeare to explore some of the themes from another perspective, from a different way. The character of Caliban obviously is affected by the audience as well. How different audiences over time will view the character differently because they bring their own set of judgments and beliefs to the play, and that's something I'll talk about next. Okay, in kind of contemplating different readings of Caliban or different ways of understanding Shakespeare's intentions, you want to try and bring in various contexts to explain these different readings. So context is AO4, and very good answers will have a kind of broad awareness and integrate these contexts within their analysis of the text and be using them to explain different readings as well. If we consider the idea that Caliban is particularly as a savage, and it just is meant to be seen that way, perhaps his heritage and the idea that he comes from witches would give weight to the idea that he's seen as evil. Shakespeare's audience of the time perhaps would believe in witches. The king certainly did, and they would be seen as a true form of evil, and therefore mentioning that Caliban comes from a witch would be placing him within that evil category as well. The colonial context we've kind of mentioned before, but this is a topic which would have been discussed in Shakespeare's time. The French Guy Montaigne was talking and questioning the West's attitude to natives that they were coming across, and was arguing that perhaps in their savagery and in their simplicity they're as noble as how people in the West would see themselves. And maybe Shakespeare's exploring this topic, this idea of the other, and the effect of dominating another culture and subjugating people to an alien culture. And maybe that's something that's being questioned throughout. I suppose in Act 3 and particularly Act 4 and Act 5, the play takes on a Christian slant. Revenge, even though it's highly, highly popular as a subject for theatre at the time, to a Christian audience, revenge and magic would be seen as something sinful. And in order to be fully forgiven and for the play to have full resolution, a Christian audience would expect Prospero to give up his magic. It would be seen as unchristian, and in order for him to be fully restored, he would have to give up that idea of magic, but also revenge. Revenge would be seen as something very sinful, and that while it makes good tragedy, it would be seen as something that would not be accepted. Now, and finally, the audience's context changes over time. How people view one race dominating another has changed dramatically since Shakespeare's time, and maybe Shakespeare was questioning that at the very time. But perhaps the idea of making fun of someone's otherness and the comedy of the subplot, while it's a very physical comedy, maybe there's a comedy that also relies on how someone is different, and maybe that changes people's approach over time. And so that's always something to consider, how different audiences bring different values and judgments to a play, and that helps you to explain different readings. Okay, that's the end.